Clint Eastwood had never been one to cower beneath the limelight. Nor had he ever minced his words to appease an audience or host, regardless of the prestige of the platform. So, when he agreed reluctantly to appear on Jimmy Kimmel Live, as part of a promotional circuit for what was being rumored to be his final film, Hollywood's inner circles buzzed with anticipation. Clint had always been a singular force, a relic of the no-nonsense Old West infused with decades of uncompromising vision and stubborn grit. And the mere idea of him sitting down for a late-night comedy show felt like throwing gasoline on a dormant flame. The studio audience that night was a mixed cocktail of die-hard Eastwood fans, curious millennials, unfamiliar with his full legacy, and Hollywood insiders who knew that behind Clint's cool steel eyes was a temper sharper than any character he'd ever played. As the lights dimmed and Jimmy Kimmel strutted onto the stage with his usual smirk and charming cadence, no one could predict that by the end of the hour, the legendary director and actor would be escorted out of the studio, his boots stomping. With fury, the cameras abruptly cut, and the internet exploding in chaos. From the moment Clint stepped onto the set, something felt off. He wasn't in the mood to entertain fluff questions or play along with the playful jabs Jimmy often lobbed at his guests. Instead, he walked with a slow, deliberate pace. His hands in the pockets of his brown leather jacket, his expression unreadable under the brim of his weathered hat. The band finished their dramatic riff. Applause erupted, but Clint didn't smile or wave. He merely gave a nod to the audience, then turned his squinting eyes on Jimmy, as if sizing him up not as a host, but as an opponent. Jimmy, ever the showman, cracked a quick joke. Now I feel like I'm in trouble with the sheriff, eliciting laughter from the audience. But Clint's face remained stone. That silence lingered for just a beat too long, enough to make Jimmy cleared his throat and attempt to pivot to the interview. He opened with softball questions about Clint's storied career, asking about Unforgiven Gran Torino and his time working with younger actors. Clint answered with curt sentences, not unfriendly, but firm, unwavering, uninterested in the chuckles or cues for laughter. The energy shifted palpably around the third question. When Jimmy brought up Clint's controversial speech at the 2012 East Republican National Convention, an old moment, but one Jimmy tried to milk for comedic effect. So, Clint, he chuckled, do you still talk to empty chairs, or have you upgraded to ghosts? The audience laughed. Clint did not. His eyes narrowed. You want to talk about ghosts? He said, voice low, weathered and dangerous. You got enough of them hanging over your network, don't you? The audience quieted. Jimmy tried to recover, brushing it off with a joke about old cowboys and grudges, but the spark had been struck. Clint leaned forward, uncrossing his arms, and began, not with a whisper, but with a storm. See, Jimmy, I came here to talk about art, about storytelling, about the cost of silence in a world gone numb. But you want punchlines and clowns. You want to dance around truth with fake smiles and applause signs. You think you're funny? But what you are, Jimmy, is a coward in a tux. The crowd gasped. Jimmy's eyes widened, unsure if this was a setup, a bit, or something dangerously real. He tried to respond, tried to maintain his grip on the show, but Clint wasn't finished. You sit here night after night, mocking men like me, mocking this country, pandering to every passing trend, all while pretending to care about freedom of speech. But let someone come on who doesn't tow your ideological leash, and you turn into a bully in makeup. The director's voice grew louder, not shouting, but with a force that made the room shake. I've spent my life making films that challenge people. I've told stories about war, racism, justice, and loss. What have you done, Jimmy? Made jokes about politicians while collecting paychecks from the same corporations that fund their campaigns? The producers backstage were now in chaos, headsets blaring, some shouting to cut to commercial, others unsure whether to let it ride for the inevitable viral exposure. Jimmy, now red-faced and nervous, attempted to interrupt. Clint, I think maybe, but Eastwood raised a hand. No, you asked the question, now you get the answer. The audience was split, some clapping nervously, others stunned into silence, a few pulling out phones to record what was clearly spiraling into a national moment. Clint's gravelly voice continued like a judge reading a sentence. You know why I agreed to this? Because I thought maybe there was one last shot at truth being heard on national television. One last shot at saying what the studios won't say. But I see now this whole circus doesn't deserve it. You people cheer for distractions, while the world crumbles around you. Jimmy looked into the camera, visibly rattled, before waving to the crew to cut to commercial. But Clint stood and pointed at the camera. Don't cut. Let them hear. This. Let them see what happens when a man who's lived through 5 wars, 7 presidents, and more backstabbing studios than I can count finally says, I'm done pretending. Then he took off his mic, dropped it on the desk, and walked off stage not hurriedly, but with deliberate defiance. The applause light blinked uselessly. Jimmy sat frozen, and the broadcast cut to black. But it was too late. The moment was already going viral. As the broadcast cut to black and the cameras blinked off, the aftershock inside the studio was immediate and almost feral. Crew members whispered to each other with frantic eyes. Production assistants scrambled to pull back up footage in case. They needed to rerun an old monologue, and Jimmy Kimmel remained seated in his chair, staring at the empty space where Clint Eastwood had stood just moments ago. A silence thicker than smoke settled over the room at Natural for a place usually filled with canned laughter and cue cards. Security hovered uncertainly near the wings, unsure whether to follow Clint or leave him be. But Clint didn't need an escort. He walked with the solemnity of a man who had just buried something sacred, his boots echoing on the polished studio floors as he made his way through the back corridors, past confused interns and stunned technicians. The dressing room door slammed shut behind him with the kind of finality only a man of Eastwood's age and authority could deliver. Inside, he removed his hat, looked at himself in the mirror, and for the first time in years, allowed his shoulders to drop not from defeat, but from release. Outside the studio, the world had already exploded. The official Twitter account for Jimmy Kimmel Live had abruptly stopped posting. Hashtags like hashtag Eastwood Uncensored, hashtag Jimmy vs. Clint, and hashtag Late Night Meltdown began trending within minutes. Clips of Clint's unscripted tirade were uploaded, duplicated, and shared in every language imaginable. Right-wing commentators hailed it as a long-overdue reckoning for liberal hypocrisy in entertainment. Progressive pundits denounced it as a toxic, unhinged rant by a relic of a bygone era. But the real ignition point came not from journalists or influencers. It came from the people, the millions watching from their couches. Subways and beds, stunned at having witnessed something that didn't feel staged, filtered, or safe. American public had grown numb to outrage, immune to shock, trained by years of algorithmic manipulation to forget a scandal within a day. But this felt different. Clint Eastwood hadn't just gone off script, he had torn the whole damn script in half and thrown it into a fire, fueled by 40 years of Hollywood's suppressed discomfort with him. And now that fire was raging. Meanwhile, inside the studio, Jimmy was surrounded by producers trying to manage the fallout. One of them, Rachel, a 10-year veteran of the network, was frantically arguing with the legal team about liability. Didn't cut fast enough, she said, her voice tight with urgency. That rant got out live in full. The FCC is going to crawl up our asses.
Ah.
Another producer shouted over her. You think the FCC is our biggest problem?
Ah.
Did you hear what he said? He basically called out every major advertiser on the network. Jimmy finally spoke, his voice quieter than usual, stripped of its usual irony. Did anyone know he was going to do that? Did anyone from Warner Brothers say he might? I don't know. Snap. But nobody answered. The truth was, Eastwood hadn't come in as a wild card. His team had sent over the usual press materials. He'd declined pre-interview banter, sure, but that wasn't uncommon for legends like him. No one had expected a thermonuclear detonation of the late-night status quo. One intern, pale and clutching a tablet, interrupted with a tremor in her voice. Guys, Elon Musk just tweeted Clint's clip with the caption, "Truth Bomb," and it's at 14 million views in the last hour. The room went silent again. They knew what that meant. The incident wasn't just a scandal, it was now a symbol. It's not one they controlled, but one being weaponized by a much larger machine. Outside the studio, paparazzi had already gathered, joined by protesters, supporters, and digital creators eager to live stream themselves, shouting into the chaos. Someone began handing out fake Team Clint cowboy hats. A counter-group across the street wore silence is violence t-shirts and carried signs saying deplatform hate. Clint, still inside his dressing room, sat in silence, unbothered by the media storm building just outside the walls. He poured himself a neat shot of bourbon, his hands steady, eyes distant. The room buzzed with 1,000 text alerts from the phone he refused to carry. He knew what he had done. Knew the world would come down on him like vultures on roadkill. But he didn't care. He'd spent too many years biting his tongue while being praised with plastic smiles. Too many years watching an industry he helped build morph into something he didn't recognize. And now, in what might have been his last public appearance, he had said what he needed to say. The fallout was irrelevant. The message was eternal. But it wasn't over yet. Because as the night wore on, the clip of the clash reached not just America, but the world. In Tokyo, subtitles turned his words into rallying cries. In Berlin, art students studied the moment as a case in postmodern dissent. In Sao Paulo, protesters painted murals of Clint staring down a caricatured Jimmy with the phrase, "the last man standing." And in Washington, D.C., political advisors debated whether to co-opt the moment for their respective narratives. What began as a late-night interview had now become a global flashpoint, strange and surreal inflection in the culture war. And the man at the center of it, a tired old gunslinger, was quietly sitting in a rented room, sipping bourbon, and waiting for whatever came next. He knew the media would twist, dissect, and meme him. They would weaponize every syllable. But that didn't matter. Because truth, once unleashed, didn't need protection. It just needed one man crazy enough to say it out loud in a world desperate enough to listen.